Washington expected noise. It expected protests, speeches, retaliatory tariffs, or at least a public confrontation. What it did not expect was silence. When President Donald Trump escalated pressure on Canada with threats, tariffs, and public humiliation, the assumption inside Washington was simple. Canada would react the way smaller allies always had: loud complaints, quiet concessions, and eventually, compliance. That assumption turned out to be the biggest miscalculation of all. Because while Trump was speaking, posting, and threatening, Mark Carney was moving, quietly, deliberately, and by the time Washington realized what had happened, the leverage it thought it had over Canada was already slipping away. The pressure campaign began the way Trump's confrontations often do: public framing first. Trump repeatedly described Canada as dependent, expendable, and economically subordinate. He suggested Canada lives because of the United States. He threatened massive tariffs if Ottawa dared deepen ties with China or other non-aligned partners. He framed trade as dominance, not partnership, and treated Canada less like a sovereign nation and more like a junior subsidiary that needed reminding of its place. Inside Washington, this approach felt familiar. Trump had used it before, with Europe, with Mexico, with Japan. The playbook was intimidation through uncertainty, threaten markets, rattle investors, force leadership to choose between domestic stability and political defiance. In most cases, it worked, but Canada did not respond the way Trump expected. There were no emergency press conferences filled with outrage, no dramatic walkouts, no immediate retaliation. Mark Carney did not escalate rhetoric. He did not trade insults. He did not issue ultimatums. Instead, he did something far more dangerous from Washington's perspective. He removed dependence. While Trump focused on using tariffs as a weapon, Carney focused on eliminating the weapon's effectiveness altogether. The shift was subtle at first. Trade delegations expanded quietly into markets Washington rarely watches closely. Canada accelerated negotiations with Europe, Southeast Asia, and emerging economies, not with fanfare, but with contracts. Infrastructure funding shifted away from cross-border dependency toward domestic capacity. Energy export routes were diversified. Supply chains were redesigned to bypass choke points Washington once controlled. From the outside, it looked like routine economic management. Inside Washington, it took time to register what was actually happening. Canada was not fighting Trump. It was outgrowing him. The core of Trump's pressure strategy rested on one assumption: that Canada had no real alternative to the U.S. market. That assumption had been true for decades. Geography, history, and integration tied Canada tightly to the American economy. Trump believed that by threatening access to that market, he could extract obedience on trade, foreign policy, even geopolitical alignment. Carney understood that reality better than anyone. And instead of arguing with it, he worked around it. Behind closed doors, Canadian policymakers began treating American unpredictability not as a temporary political phase, but as a permanent risk factor. That shift changed everything. Decisions were no longer made based on restoring stability with Washington. They were made based on reducing exposure to Washington altogether. Energy deals with India accelerated. Agricultural exports found new buyers. Arctic shipping infrastructure received funding that had been delayed for decades. Canadian firms were encouraged, sometimes quietly pressured, to build redundancy into their supply chains rather than efficiency tied to the U.S. border. Each move on its own looked incremental. Together, they formed a structural pivot. Trump's rhetoric grew harsher as his leverage weakened. Threats escalated from 25% tariffs to 100% warnings. Social media posts became more personal. Canada was accused of betrayal, of being used by China, of acting ungrateful. The tone signaled frustration, not strength. Washington's mistake was assuming silence meant fear. Inside U.S. policy circles, alarm began to spread. Analysts noticed trade flows shifting. American exporters saw Canadian demand flatten, then decline. Investment that once flowed naturally through U.S. financial channels started rerouting through Europe and Asia. Canadian companies stopped waiting for American approval and started planning for American irrelevance. This was not a dramatic break. It was a quiet decoupling. What shocked Washington was not that Canada pushed back. It was that Canada stopped reacting altogether. Trump could threaten tariffs all he wanted, but threats lose power when the target no longer depends on you. Carney's strategy was brutally simple. If trade can be weaponized, then dependency is the real vulnerability. Eliminate dependency, and the weapon becomes useless. The most unsettling part for Washington was how difficult it was to counter. You cannot sanction someone for investing in domestic capacity. You cannot punish diversification without admitting you were exploiting dependence in the first place. Every aggressive response only reinforced Canada's justification for pulling further away. Trump's approach relied on spectacle. Carney's relied on mathematics. By the time Washington began openly discussing Canada drift, the damage was already done. Trade agreements do not unwind easily. Infrastructure investments do not reverse because of a tweet. New partnerships create constituencies that resist returning to old dependencies. What made this even more destabilizing was the signal it sent to other U.S. allies. If Canada could quietly reduce exposure to American pressure without triggering collapse, others could too. Europe watched carefully. So did parts of Asia. Mexico took notes. Trump believed he was demonstrating power. Instead, he demonstrated volatility. Volatility is manageable for speculators. It is unacceptable for long-term planners. Carney's restraint amplified the contrast. While Trump framed every interaction as dominance versus submission, Carney framed Canada as a system that would function regardless of Washington's mood. That posture resonated internationally. Stability became Canada's brand. Predictability became its leverage. Inside Washington, officials struggled to respond without admitting failure. Publicly, the administration continued to downplay Canada's moves. Privately, concerns mounted about lost influence that might never return. This was not about one trade dispute. It was about the erosion of a hierarchy that had defined North American politics for generations. Trump's belief that economic pressure automatically produces obedience underestimated something critical. National pride does not always respond to pain by surrendering. Sometimes it responds by redesigning the system that allows pain to be inflicted. Carney understood that lesson deeply. His silence was not passivity, it was insulation. The irony is sharp. Trump wanted to force Canada closer. Instead, he pushed it further away, not through rebellion, but through independence. Washington was shocked not because Canada defied Trump loudly, but because it did not need to defy him at all. The power imbalance Trump relied on began to dissolve quietly, without drama, without confrontation, and without asking permission. That is what made it dangerous. When power fades quietly, it is hardest to reclaim. There is no moment to reverse, no treaty to renegotiate, no apology that restores what no longer exists. Trump tried to bully Canada into submission. Mark Carney responded by making the bullying irrelevant, and Washington is still trying to figure out how it happened. If you want to understand how power really shifts in global politics, not through shouting matches, but through quiet strategy and irreversible decisions, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories don't explode overnight. They unfold in silence, through trade routes rerouted, alliances recalculated, and leverage that disappears before anyone announces it's gone. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Trump underestimate Canada, or did Mark Carney expose a weakness Washington didn't realize it had? We'll keep tracking how this new balance takes shape, because once power moves this way, it rarely comes back.